Jacen clenched his fists and opened them again, and placed one against the bandage she had tied around his ribs. "Your tears, Vergere. You could save so many lives." "Yes, I could." "Please, Vergere, will you?" "No." "Please." "No, Jacen Solo, I will not." "Why should I?" "They are slaves." "They're people." She shrugged. "You helped me," Jacen said, desperation and anger starting to gather behind his voice. "Why would you do this for me and not for any of them?" "Why" is a question deeper than its answer. She settled back onto the mossy ground. Her crest lay flat along the curve of her skull. "Tell me this, Jacen Solo. What distinguishes a flower from a weed?" "Vergere, this is not a riddle. What distinguishes a flower from a weed is only, and exactly, this: the choice of the gardener." "I'm not a gardener," Jacen said, biting down on his temper. He leaned toward her, blood surging into his face. "And these are not weeds." She shrugged. "Again, our difficulties may be linguistic. To me, a gardener is one who chooses what to cultivate and what to uproot, who decides which lives must end so that the lives he cherishes may flourish." She lowered her head as though shy or embarrassed, sighing. She opened her hand toward the headless shells of the clip beetles. "Is that not what you have done?" He kept his eyes on her, hanging on to his anger. "Those are bugs, Vergere." "So is a shadow moth." "I'm talking about people." "Were the beetles less alive than the slave? Is not a life, whatever form it takes?" Jacen lowered his head. "He can't make me say I was wrong to do it. It wasn't wrong. He's a sentient being. Those were insects." She gave out a wind-chime spray of laughter. "I did not say it was wrong, Jacen Solo. Am I a moralist? I only point out that you make the gardener's choice." Jacen had always been stubborn. He was far from ready to give up. "You're the gardener," he muttered sullenly, staring at his hands. "I'm just one of the weeds." She placed her hand on his arm, her long, flexible fingers warm and gentle. Her touch was so clearly friendly, even affectionate, that Jacen for one moment felt as though his force empathy had not deserted him. He knew, absolutely and without question, that Vergere meant him no harm, that she cared for him and regretted his anger, his hostility, and his suffering. "But that doesn't mean she's on my side," he reminded himself. "How is it," she asked slowly, "that you have come to be the medical droid for your slave gang? Of all the jobs that all the slaves do, how did this one fall to you?" "There's no one else who can do it." "No one who can set a bone? No one who can wash clean a cut? No one who can twist the head off a clip beetle?" Jacen shrugged. "No one who can tell the Duryam to blow itself out an airlock." "Ah." That translucent inner lid slid down her eye. "The Duryam disapproves?" "Let's say it took some convincing." "Convincing?" "Yeah." She said nothing for a long time. She might have been waiting for him to elaborate. She might have been trying to guess what he had done. She might have been thinking of something else altogether. "And how did you manage to convince it?" Jacen stared through her, remembering his savage private struggle against the slave seed and the Duryam that controlled it, day after day of bitter agony. He wondered how much of that story she might know already. He was certain that she had some way of keeping him under observation. The Duryam was an intelligent creature. It had not taken long to discover that Jacen could not be moved by pain. But the Duryam was itself stubborn by nature, and it had been specifically engineered to command. It was not accustomed to disobedience, nor inclined to tolerate it. After days of straight, simple pain, the Duryam had taken advantage of the slave seed's growth. It had spent more than a week jerking Jacen's limbs individually by remote control, using the slave seed to give him spasms and cramps that forced him to move, making him twitch and thrash like a hollow monster, controlled by a half-melted logic board. The turning point had come when the Duryam realized that it had been pouring so much energy and attention into its struggle with Jacen that it was neglecting its other slaves. Its domain in the nursery was falling to ruin, becoming a wasteland among the lush domains of its sibling rivals. It understood that breaking Jacen was an expensive undertaking, a project whose costs were counted in jobs that did not get done. And it soon began to discover that Jacen could be useful, even unbroken. Jacen had taken every respite from the pain to minister to his fellow slaves. He didn't have real medical training, but his exotic life-form collection had taught him some basics of exobiology, and in his adventures with the other young Jedi, he had garnered a working knowledge of field surgery. The Duryam had eventually seemed to understand that healthy slaves can work harder, and soon its domain began to improve again. Jacen had discovered that the Duryam would let him do pretty much whatever he wanted, so long as it advanced the Duryam's own interests. I guess you could say, Jacen thought, I taught the Duryam that sometimes partners are more useful than slaves. But he said nothing of this. He owed Vergere no answers. I told you before, he muttered solidly. You can kill me, but you can't make me obey. Her inner eyelids slid upward again. And that, Jacen Solo, is why you are a flower among the weeds. He looked into the bottomless black of her eyes, looked away at the scatter of slaves, resting among the vong-formed life of the nursery, then down at his hands, which curled into white-knuckled fists. He relaxed them again, then looked back at her, and finally, after all, he couldn't think of any reason not to just say it. You're Sith, aren't you? She went very, very still. Am I? I know a little about the dark side, Vergere. All this garbage about flowers and weeds. I know what you're really talking about. You're talking about believing you're above people. Everything I tell you is a save it. You're wasting your time. Jaina and I were kidnapped by the Shadow Academy. They tried to turn us both. It didn't work. He thought briefly of Jaina, of the darkness he'd felt in his last touch through their twin bond. His hands became fists again, and he shook the memory out of his head. He repeated, It didn't work. It won't work for you either. Her first motion, a faint curve at the corners of her lips. Sith? Jedi? She said. Are these the only choices? Dark or light, good or evil? Is there no more to the Force than this? What is the screen on which light and dark cast their shapes and shadows? Where is the ground on which stands good and evil? Save it. I've spent too much time wondering about those questions already. Years. I never got anywhere. Her eyes lit up merrily. You got here, yes? A sweep of her arm took in the nursery. Is this not somewhere? Jacen shook his head, tired of this. He pushed himself to his feet. All the answers fall short of the truth. Very good. Vergere clapped her hands and bounced upright like a spring-loaded puppet. Very good, Jacen Solo. Questions are more true than answers. This is the beginning of wisdom. Your kind of wisdom. Is there any other kind? Does truth come in breeds like nerfs? She seemed elated. She shivered as though she struggled against an urge to break into dance. Here's a question of another kind, an easy kind of friendly inquiry, to which there is an answer not only true, but useful. Jacen got up. I don't have time for this. They'll turn on the sun in a few minutes. He started walking toward the resting slaves. There were dressings to be changed before these slaves began their morning work. Vergere spoke to his departing back. If the Force is life, how can there be life without the Force? What? Jacen stopped. He looked over his shoulder. What? You are born to be a gardener, she said. Remember this. It is not only your right to choose flowers over weeds. It is your responsibility. Which are flowers? Which are weeds? The choice is yours. What? With a lightning crackle and a wave-front blast of thunder, the nursery's sun kindled overhead. Jacen flinched, shading his eyes against the sudden flare, and by the time he could see again, Vergere was far away, hopping from hummock to hummock across the Von Dune crab bog. He stared after her. If the Force is life, how can there be life without the Force?